like my sense of faith or spirituality or the sacred does not come from the Abrahamic Judeo-Christian tradition. And, I think in a lot of ways, like to kind of circle us back to Jung, like I think this is one of my big draws to Jung is, every psychology will obviously be influenced by the questions of its founder. And I think, for Jung, the question of Jungian psychology is spirituality. It's, Jung grew up with like his father was a priest, a Jesuit priest, and I think kind of had his own really dark relationship with faith. It's a big question for Jung in his entire life. And one of the things he really emphasizes is the kind of spiritual function in the psyche is so important. That connection to something larger than yourself, belief in something larger than yourself, the medicinal energy of that for our kind of place in the universe, our capacity to kind of feel guided. I mean, he makes a huge point that that's enormously relevant, and I believe in that 100%. But I think the reason why I say, I'm really drawn to Jung in that sense is Jung says, like, we need an active symbol of the sacred. It has to be relevant to your personhood. And so if you come from, if you align with the Judeo-Christian Godhead and the symbols of that mythology, great. Let that be your way into that energy. And there are a growing group of people, I think, in our culture that don't. And if you don't, then you're either going to lose that sacred function in the psyche, or you have to get busy finding what are the alive symbols for you. And, I think for Jung and for his framework, that comes from the self, and it comes from your dreams and your experiences of kind of synchronicity or numinosity. But the idea being, what feels alive? What makes you connect to something larger than yourself? What's your image of that for you can feel relevant? And if you can, then you can tap into that archetypal energy that is the basis of all religion and feel that connection to something larger than you that orders the world, that explains things, that roots you in something. But it needs to be alive for it to be meaningful for the psyche. Yeah.
The very idea of, synchronicities and the collective unconscious and archetypes tells me that it can't really be physical, can it? It must be non-physical in a way, or where does the unconscious reside? Does the brain have anything to do with it, as you see it?
Yeah,
perhaps.
It's like, I feel like one of the richest and most like unknowable questions and answers, although our, steps towards neuroscience are pretty remarkable. Near the end of Jung's life, he started this relationship with this metaphysicist, Wolfgang Pauli. And
I know, the Jung-Pauli connection or conjecture, I think it's called.
Yeah. And I think, if Jung had lived longer than his very long life anyway, he, near the end of his life, he got really, really interested, and his later works are all about kind of this question of where does psyche reside?
Yeah. Quantum physics and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And this connection, synchronicity and that acasual connection. And I think, if you've had a powerful synchronicity, it's like, what? You start asking these questions, these metaphysical questions of kind of what is Kejap, because we come from that Cartesian, Newtonian, hard, this exists because I can touch it and feel it. And we've changed that ideology. But I think because our senses don't function that way, it's really hard to wrap your head around, like the fact that this table, like, isn't really a table and doesn't really exist. You're like, okay, like, I don't know what to do with that. But Jung gets really into, he calls it the psychoid archetype that he spends a lot of time on in the end of his life. And this idea of kind of this matrix of everything that's connected. And, there isn't a separation between you and I in any kind of energetic way, nor our psyches. And where does all this come from? Is it an epiphenomenon of the brain or not? I would argue the analytical and the depth perspective would suggest that it's not just an epiphenomenon of the brain.
I'm with you.
Yeah, it
and
seems
when you look at those flocks of birds, is that the word?
Yeah,
like the
Murmurs.
starlings.
Yeah, the starlings.
They are. It's really incredible. They turn. Thousands of them turn exactly at the same time. It's not, there's no delay at all. It's like, it is one organism, truly.
It is. So, and and that's back to that kind of our Cartesian divide thing. Like, what if we didn't think of the world as completely divided, as completely
separate? It would change
separate?
a lot. Yeah. I think
it would change an enormous amount.
We would feel better, I think. We wouldn't suffer as much.
Yeah, I think we would. I mean, I can't even imagine it in some way, but we would definitely relate to each other and our planet differently if we really thought that, like the plant behind you is an extension of your being on some level, and you hurt it and you hurt you on some level. I mean, all those ideas, they're so radical, but I think we're moving in that direction.
You think so? You're an optimist in that respect? Or in many respects, perhaps? I don't know you, but maybe you are.
Let's see. Do I believe that? I don't know. I want to believe it. So maybe, and you know what? I do see changes in it. I think in small ways. I think our culture is becoming really anemic for its need for something deeper, something more embodied, something more spiritual, more sacred, more connected. I read some statistic the other day that was saying, something like 40% of teenagers say that they're so lonely that they don't even know how to connect to other people. And it's like, even if that statistic is cut that statistic in half, and it's still huge, and I think there's maybe I hope that there's a balance that can come, and I think there is a loneliness and a disconnection and like I said, an anemia that our culture's suffering under, and maybe to balance it out, there's a call for something. It's kind of how I feel about myth. I feel like when I tell people myths in my practice, for example, if I say, this reminds me of that, or it's like water on a parched soul. People are just like, what? They feel connected to something older, deeper, more alive, And when I was teaching about a year ago, I was teaching at this college, and about a couple days into it, this gal came up to me and she was like, I just want to let you know, you're just like one of the most empathetic people I've ever seen in my life. And which was a very interesting comment because, between you and me, that's not who I am. But I told her, I was like, I'm wondering if you feel so enormously seen by these ideas, that they're touching something in you that feels so true and validating, because I didn't know the girl's last name. Well, I probably did on my roster sheet, but I didn't know anything about her life. I couldn't have empathy for this person.
But you were the person who conveyed these myths and these ideas, and that was empathetic to her.
Yeah, I was seeing something, and that's where the hope in me comes from. It's like maybe people will see some of these ideas and feel, a soothing on some level and be drawn to them and bring us more connected and more in balance. And
is it a good idea? I know you have some issues with, you're a psychologist yourself, but you have some issues with modern psychology, other types of psychology, I reckon. Is it a good idea to draw a line between psychology and philosophy and I mean, spirituality for that matter? What do you think?
I would not draw a line. I mean, I think that line has been drawn. I would say, more depth approaches, something that studies the unconscious, you can't draw that line because it is, I think maybe a simple way to answer that is it is no mistake that kind of the emergence of psychology came from a transition in the human history where we went from more tribal living, more religiously connected living that was closer to the land, closer to community, much more related in those ways, and kind of moved into cities, created a more industrial life, became more individualistic, and then invented psychology and called ourselves sick. It's like that happened at the same time. And I think psychology is the modern response to the loss of the sacred and in an active, alive relationship with that depth of our being. And I would say the two are enormously interchangeable.